Well, you might not know, but if your pastor actually went to an accredited seminary, they definitely know. And unfortunately, that makes what I'm about to say potentially even worse, because this one's going to challenge you. So why does the Bible seem to say completely opposite things depending on who's preaching? One pastor will condemn women in leadership, one will not. Another will promise riches, another doesn't. Another justifies war and honoring authoritarian figures. Others tear that concept down. So how can one sacred book be used to defend so many conflicting beliefs? Here we go. There are two primary ways people approach scripture: exegesis and eisegesis. If you've never heard those terms before, do not worry. Most people have it. Churches rarely teach this stuff for a reason. But if your pastor went to an accredited seminary, I promise you, they know these terms. And these two approaches shape everything: what gets preached, what gets ignored, what becomes doctrine, and what becomes dogma. And how you read determines what you will see. And what you see determines what you will believe. And here's the wild part. In the first year of nearly every accredited ministry school, students are taught this: use exegesis. Avoid eisegesis as much as possible. It's foundational stuff. If you want to rightly handle scripture, this is not optional. But then after graduation, in pulpits all over the world, eisegesis creeps back in. Sometimes not so subtly, and eventually it will reshape entire church cultures. So exegesis comes from a word that means to draw out. You ask, who wrote this? Who were they writing to? When was it written? What was happening at the time? Where were they? And why did this message matter? You're not trying to make the text say something. You're listening to what it already said. You're learning, discovering, letting the text speak on its own terms. If we really honor the Bible as much as we say we do, this is what we use. But eisegesis is a little bit different. Eisegesis means to read into. It's when you bring your own beliefs, your biases, and your assumptions to the text and squeeze it into your existing worldview. It's not reading to understand, it is reading to confirm. Eisegesis skips historical questions. It skips the context, it skips the culture. And that's when things fall apart, because you can make it say whatever you want to say. Here's the one that always comes to mind. If you were taught the story of the widow's mite is about the beauty of sacrificial giving to the church, that's not exegesis, that's eisegesis. Because in context, Jesus was not praising the widow. He was exposing the system that exploited her. Go back and read it again. Mark 12 does not stand alone. It's part of a larger temple critique that spans several chapters. In Mark 11, Jesus flips tables. In Mark 12, he calls out the scribes who devour widows' houses. And then literally right after he says that, he points to this widow giving her last 2 coins and says, "See, there you go." Not to applaud the widow, but to indict the temple system that would take her last bits and call it holy. This was not a lesson in generosity. It was a prophetic judgment on a system built on appearances, greed, and religious performance. And just like he said a few sentences later, with the indictment of this temple system, the whole temple would come crashing down in that generation. Exegesis honors the Bible as a living, breathing story. It listens, it questions, it lets the text speak from within its own world. Eisegesis does not do that. It treats scripture like a mirror, only ever reflecting what you already believe or what you want others to do. And that's how sacred texts get weaponized. That's how systems stay unchallenged. That's how the widow becomes a sermon illustration on sacrificial giving instead of what it's really about, which is a victim who was failed by the very system meant to protect her. The widow's mite wasn't a story about how much you should give. It's a warning about what happens when religion stops protecting the vulnerable and starts feeding on them. Another example, 1 Timothy 2:12, I don't permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. And this verse has been used to silence women for centuries, but Paul was not writing a universal rule. He was writing to Timothy in Ephesus, a city dominated by the temple of Artemis, led by female priests who held spiritual control. And the Greek word Paul uses here, authentine, doesn't mean healthy authority. It implies domineering or abusive control, and it only appears once in the entire Bible. So Paul's addressing a specific issue in a specific church, in a specific city, with a specific problem with women in dominating positions of leadership. But when that gets ignored, whole denominations use one verse ripped from its contextual world to deny women their voice. It's not biblical faithfulness. That's eisegesis. Another big example, Luke 16, the rich man and Lazarus. You probably heard this one preached like a literal roadmap of hell, right? Eternal flames, torment, great chasm, no escape. But that's not what Jesus was doing here. He wasn't building a doctrine of the afterlife. He was telling a satirical parable based on a well-known Jewish folk story at the time. It was a rebuke. It was a warning to religious elites who hoarded wealth while the poor suffered at their gates. It was about justice, not geography. Read it in context, ask who he's talking to, and why. But when eisegesis enters the picture, we make it about fire and brimstone, and we turn a symbolic story into a weaponized theology, and we lose the point entirely. Eisegesis distorts. It builds doctrine out of isolation. It lifts verses from their time and forces them into ours. It reinforces the power structures we already believe in, our church leaders want you to believe in, while ignoring the voices Scripture was meant to lift up. But exegesis humbles you. It asks you to sit down, to slow down, to enter into someone else's world before you force the text into yours. It doesn't mean you'll always get it right, because that's not how it works, but it means that you're willing to try. It means the Bible stops being a mirror for your opinions and becomes a window into something bigger than you. So let me break it down one last time. Eisegesis says, here's what I believe, now let me find a verse that supports it. Exegesis says, here's a verse, now let me discover what it actually meant. Eisegesis creates certainty that backs up confirmation bias. Exegesis cultivates curiosity. It honors the Bible as a living, breathing word. Eisegesis defends your camp. Exegesis invites you to grow. And if you've spent your whole life hearing sermons that skip the questions, if no one ever told you to ask who wrote it or when or why, it's not your fault. But now that you know, you don't have to settle for secondhand theology anymore. You can ask better questions, you honor the text on its own terms, and you can learn to hear the Bible without the static of inherited assumptions that have been placed on you. Because sometimes the first step towards truth is realizing how many times we've been taught to read it wrong. But God bless. You're loved. See you soon.